I was 17 years, 4 months, and 6 days into my army career, holding the rank of lieutenant colonel, when my own mother-in-law told a room full of relatives that I used to do paperwork somewhere overseas. Nobody in that room knew my hands had once trembled less holding a rifle than they did holding a coffee cup at my own wedding shower. If you've ever watched everyone at a table quietly decide you're smaller than you are, and you've ever had to sit there and let them, drop where you're watching from and hit subscribe, because I'm about to tell you exactly how that room learned my name. 3 things were happening at once that spring, and none of them had finished happening yet. My husband, Gregory Marsh, had filed for divorce 9 days after I collapsed in our kitchen, and buried inside his petition was a demand for full custody of our son, built on the claim that my instability made me unfit. That was the first thread, and it would not be cut until a judge read something out loud that Greg never expected to exist. The second thread was older and colder, an envelope I'd kept sealed in a lockbox for 6 years, containing a letter from a 2-star general, and the reason I hadn't opened it was that I'd hoped I would never need it. The third thread was the quietest and the most dangerous, because it was the question of what would happen to everyone standing in that courtroom once they understood, all at the same time, exactly what I had actually been doing for 17 years, while they called it paperwork. I met Gregory Marsh 11 years ago at a fundraiser in Alexandria, Virginia, back when I was a captain, and he was a rising account director at a firm that billed itself as strategic consulting. He was tall in the way that photographs well, and he had a laugh that filled a room before you'd finished the joke. My mother liked to say Greg looked like a man who had never once had to wait for anything, and she meant it as a compliment. I married him 14 months later in a base chapel with my dress uniform pressed so sharp you could have cut paper on the seam, and his mother, Eleanor Marsh, stood in the second row with an expression I would spend the next decade learning to read, as contempt wearing the mask of politeness. Eleanor was the widow of a district court judge, and she never let anyone forget that her late husband had actually practiced law, a phrase she deployed with surgical timing whenever my work came up at dinner. When people asked what I did, Greg would answer for me before I could open my mouth. "Diane handles logistics," he'd say, smiling, "moving supplies around, that kind of thing." And then he'd change the subject to his quarterly numbers, and I would sit there with a security clearance he didn't know the level of, watching him narrate my life into something small enough to fit inside his. The truth was that I had spent 6 of those 11 years assigned to a military intelligence detachment, supporting operations I could not discuss at dinner parties, could not discuss with my husband, and in the final 2 years, could not discuss with anyone below a certain clearance, even inside my own chain of command. I had been in places whose names never made the news, doing work that, if it had gone wrong, would have gone wrong in ways nobody would have ever explained to my family. I came home from a 9-month rotation once, with a scar along my left forearm that I told Eleanor was from an equipment accident, and she nodded the way you nod at a child's story about a monster under the bed, indulgent and unconvinced. I learned, over those years, to let the misunderstanding stand, because the alternative was violating an oath I had made, long before I made the one to Greg. I did not know yet that my silence would someday be used in a courtroom as evidence that I had nothing to say for myself. Our son, Mason, was born the year I made major, and it was Mason who first noticed something the adults around him refused to see. He was 8 years old, quiet, watchful in the particular way children become when they've absorbed more tension in a house than anyone has explained to them, and he used to sit at the top of the stairs during my late calls, listening to me speak in clipped, careful half-sentences to people whose names he was never given. He told his school counselor once, unprompted, that his mother talked to generals, and the counselor wrote it down as an example of a child's imaginative embellishment, filed it, and forgot it. Nobody in the Marsh family ever asked Mason where he'd gotten that idea. If they had, the whole timeline of what happened next might have looked different. The first open loop, the one that would take the longest to close, began on a Tuesday morning 11 months ago, when a process server found me in the parking lot of Walter Reed and handed me an envelope while I was still holding a folder of my own discharge medical paperwork. Inside was Greg's petition, drafted by an attorney named Bradley Finch, a man Eleanor had recommended personally, a man who wore his confidence the way some men wear cologne, too much and impossible to ignore. The petition asked for sole physical and legal custody of Mason, citing what it called a documented pattern of erratic behavior and medical instability on my part, and it asked the court to freeze my share of our joint accounts pending review, on the theory that I posed a flight risk with our son. Reading it in that parking lot, in November, with the wind cutting through the thin fabric of my discharge blouse, I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the same stillness I remembered from the moment before a convoy briefing when everyone else's hands were shaking and mine had already stopped. The second open loop was a lockbox in my father's garage in Ohio, containing a single sealed envelope with a return address I had memorized without ever needing to look at it twice. The office of Major General Owen Castellano, retired, formerly my brigade commander during the 2 years of my service that remained, and still remain, classified above what I am permitted to describe even now. General Castellano had written that letter to me 6 years earlier, after a mission I still will not name in full, and he had told me, in his own handwriting, that if the day ever came when someone tried to erase what I had done in that theater, I was authorized to open the envelope and use what was inside it. I had never opened it. I had hoped, foolishly, that I would live my whole retirement without needing a general's sworn word to prove to my own husband's family that I was not a liar. The third open loop was the quietest, and it lived inside my own body. 4 months before Greg filed, I had collapsed in our kitchen while making Mason's lunch, my vision narrowing to a pinhole before the linoleum came up to meet me, and I woke up in an ambulance with a paramedic, asking me my name and the year. The diagnosis, once the neurologists finished their scans, was a seizure disorder connected to a traumatic brain injury I had sustained during an incident overseas that I was still not cleared to describe in detail, an injury the Army itself had documented in a medical record, classified alongside the operation that caused it. Greg had been in the room when the civilian ER doctor, unable to access my full military medical history, wrote, "Cause undetermined, possible psychogenic component," on a discharge summary. Greg took that single uncertain phrase, printed on ordinary hospital letterhead, and built an entire legal argument on top of it, because it was easier to believe his wife was fabricating a collapse than to imagine what she might have survived to earn one. I want to tell you about the dinner 4 weeks before the petition was filed, because it's the dinner where the pattern crystallized, the pattern I would later watch shatter in open court. Eleanor had hosted it at her home in McLean, a house with a dining table long enough to seat 14, and a chandelier she mentioned had been appraised twice. Mason was upstairs with his cousins, Greg's new colleague from the firm, a woman named Vanessa Cole, had been invited under the label of a work friend, and she sat 2 seats down from my husband, wearing an expression of polite curiosity that I recognized, even then, as something rehearsed. Eleanor turned to me over the second course, her fork paused mid-air, and said, in the same tone she'd have used to comment on the weather, "Diane, dear, I do hope you're not overdoing it with all this doctor business. Greg says you've been telling people it's from your service, but you were always in an office, weren't you?" The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone already knows the answer they're supposed to give. Bradley Finch, seated at the far end because Eleanor had begun including him at family dinners months before the divorce was ever filed, a detail that told me everything about how long this had been planned, smiled into his wineglass and said, "Some people confuse being deployed with being in danger. It's an easy mistake to make from a desk." Vanessa Cole didn't say anything at all that night, but she reached over and refilled Greg's water glass with a familiarity that belonged to someone who had done it many times before, and Greg let her, without looking at me, and that was the moment I understood the marriage was already over, and only the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. There was a second dinner, 6 weeks before that one, that I think about almost as often, because it showed me the specific shape of each antagonist's cruelty before they'd fully coordinated it into a single strategy. Eleanor had asked me, over dessert, whether the Army gave some kind of certificate for retiring. The way she said, "A company gives a watch, And when I told her there had in fact been a formal ceremony, with a full color guard, and a Legion of Merit citation read aloud by a brigadier general, she smiled the small, tight smile she used whenever she'd decided a fact was too inconvenient to accept, and said, "How nice for you, dear," in a tone that made the word nice sound like an insult wearing a name tag. Bradley Finch, at that same table, already circling the family long before any petition existed, leaned toward Greg and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "You know, in my experience, when a spouse gets that cagey about specifics, there's usually less there than they want you to think." And Greg laughed, actually laughed, a short, embarrassed bark of a laugh, and did not correct him, did not say a single word in my defense. And I sat there with my water glass sweating a ring onto Eleanor's linen tablecloth, and understood, for the first time with total clarity, that my own husband found it easier to laugh along with an insult to his wife than to risk looking foolish in front of his mother's favorite attorney. Vanessa Cole's cruelty, when it came, never announced itself as cruelty at all, which was its own particular kind of dangerous. She specialized in a soft, concerned tone that always managed to leave a bruise. At a company holiday party I attended with Greg that same winter, back when I still believed attending those parties mattered to our marriage, Vanessa found me by the coat check and said, tilting her head with what looked, to anyone watching, like genuine warmth, "Greg mentioned you've been having some health scares. That must be so hard, especially with your whole military thing being so, hard to pin down for the doctors. Have you thought about seeing someone who specializes in stress-related conditions?" I told her my neurologist was in fact a specialist, and she patted my arm, actually patted it, twice, and said, of course, I just worry," in a voice pitched perfectly, for anyone within 10 feet, to hear a concerned friend, rather than a woman, quietly planting the seed that would later grow into an affidavit's supporting narrative. I did not know yet that she and Bradley Finch had exchanged 3 separate phone calls that same month, calls that would surface later, during discovery, as evidence that the concern had never been spontaneous at all. It was Eleanor, 3 weeks later, at Mason's school recital, who said the sentence that would come back to haunt this entire family in a courtroom months later. She was speaking to another mother in the lobby, not realizing I was close enough to hear, and she said, "Between us, she was never really a soldier, more of a secretary who got to wear the uniform." I stood there, holding a program with Mason's name printed on it, in a school office's plain black font, and I did not correct her. I have thought since about why I let it stand, and the honest answer is that correcting Eleanor Marsh had never once worked, not in 11 years, and I had stopped spending ammunition on arguments I already knew I couldn't win, with words alone. I filed the sentence away instead, the way I'd been trained to file away anything useful, and I waited. Bradley Finch built his case over the following months with the confidence of a man who had never once had a client's version of events actually turn out to be true. He deposed my primary care physician, a kind, overworked man named Dr. Aaron Petrosian, who had only ever seen the civilian side of my chart, and used the doctor's honest admission that he did not have access to Lieutenant Colonel Marsh's complete service medical record, as proof, in his framing, that no complete record existed at all. He subpoenaed 3 years of my bank statements looking for what he called unexplained absences and unexplained deposits. Not understanding, or not caring, that a soldier's pay during a classified deployment routes through channels a civilian attorney has no legal mechanism to fully trace. He filed a motion requesting that I submit to an independent psychiatric evaluation, attaching Eleanor's sworn affidavit, describing me as increasingly detached from reality since her medical episode. An affidavit Eleanor signed in Bradley's office on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days before Thanksgiving. While I was 3 states away testifying, under a court seal I could not discuss with my own family, in an unrelated federal matter that had required my specific security clearance. My ally in all of this arrived in the unglamorous form of a phone call I almost didn't answer. Colonel Samuel Hayes, United States Army, retired, had served as Judge Advocate General Staff during 2 of my deployments, the man who had personally handled the classification review on the incident that caused my traumatic brain injury. And he called me the week after the custody petition landed, because a mutual friend from my old unit had mentioned, in passing, that Marcia's ex is trying to paint her as unstable. Hayes had a voice like gravel settling, unhurried, and the first thing he said to me was, "Lieutenant Colonel, do you still have Castellano's letter?" I told him I did. He told me, in that same unhurried voice, that it was time to stop protecting people who had never once protected me. And he began, quietly and methodically, the process of getting portions of my classified medical and service record declassified for the specific and limited purpose of a civil family court proceeding. A process that took 4 months, 6 signatures from officers with stars on their shoulders, and 1 direct conversation with General Castellano himself, who told Hayes over the phone, "Tell her to open the envelope. Tell her I said it's time." The pista, the concrete thread Hayes and I had planted early and let sit quiet for months, was not the letter itself, but the manila folder that held the paperwork authorizing its declassification review. A folder Hayes kept, deliberately, in plain sight on the corner of his desk, every time Bradley Finch's junior associate came by for scheduled discovery meetings. Unlabeled except for a case number, thick enough to be noticed, thin enough to reveal nothing if opened. Bradley's associate mentioned it twice in emails that later became part of the record, speculating to her supervisor about some kind of second file Hayes keeps referencing but won't produce. And Bradley, arrogant enough to believe no civil attorney could outmaneuver a family court timeline, dismissed it both times as a bluff, telling his own client, according to billing notes later subpoenaed, that the wife's team is stalling because they have nothing. He built his entire cross-examination strategy around that assumption, and it was the single costliest miscalculation of his career. The week before the hearing's 4th day, the week the declassification review finally cleared, Hayes called me into his office and set the actual envelope, resealed in an evidence sleeve, on the desk between us, and asked me, not as an attorney but as a fellow officer, whether I was certain I wanted to go through with using it. Because once General Castellano's letter entered a public record, however redacted, some detail of what it protected would exist, permanently, somewhere Eleanor's future grandchildren could eventually search for it. I thought about Mason at the top of the stairs, listening to half sentences he wasn't allowed to understand, and I told Hayes to file it. He nodded once, the way men like Hayes nod when a decision has been correctly made, and picked up the phone to schedule the exhibit. The night before that 4th day of testimony, I couldn't sleep, and I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd collapsed months earlier, running my thumb along the same scar on my forearm I'd once told Eleanor came from an equipment accident. And I thought about every dinner where I'd let a smaller version of myself sit in my chair, so the room could stay comfortable. Ethan called at 11, sensing without being told that I wouldn't be asleep, and he didn't try to reassure me with anything specific. He just stayed on the line while I made tea I didn't drink. And at one point he said, "You know tomorrow doesn't make you any more of who you already are, right? It just makes everyone else catch up." And I held on to that sentence like a handrail through the rest of that long, cold night. My other anchor through those months was my younger brother, Ethan, a high school history teacher in Columbus who had never worn a uniform in his life and had spent our entire childhood being told by our own extended family that I was the serious one, and he was the fun one, a distinction that had quietly cost him as much as my classification cost me. Ethan flew out twice that winter, slept on my pull-out couch, and did the unglamorous work nobody puts in the highlight reel. He picked Mason up from school on the days my hands shook too badly to trust myself behind the wheel. He sat with me at 2 in the morning, when the anticipatory anxiety of the hearing kept sleep somewhere just out of reach. And he never once asked me to explain the parts of my service I couldn't explain. "I don't need the classified version," he told me once, handing me a mug of black coffee at an hour when the sky was still more black than grey. "I just need you to still be standing when this is over." He did not contest anything in court. He simply made sure I was fed, upright, and not alone. And there is a version of this story where that quiet, unglamorous loyalty mattered more than any letter with a general's signature on it. Bradley Finch's cross-examination strategy when the hearing finally began in the Anne Arundel County Family Court, in front of Judge Patricia Wren, was built entirely around the discharge summary's 3 uncertain words. He stood at a lectern, positioned so the morning light from the tall courtroom windows fell directly across my face, and he read the phrase, "Cause undetermined, possible psychogenic component," into the record 4 separate times in 90 minutes, each time pausing afterward to let the silence do his work for him. He asked me, in front of my own son's court-appointed guardian ad litem, whether it was true that I had once told a neighbor I used to run logistics, and when I answered that logistics was, in fact, part of my accurate cover description for work I was not authorized to detail further, he turned to the gallery, where Eleanor and Vanessa sat together in the second row, and said, loudly enough for the whole room, "Your Honor, we have a pattern here of a woman who cannot keep her own story straight." Eleanor nodded. Vanessa Cole, seated close enough to my husband that their shoulders touched, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, the same smile I remembered from that dinner table in McLean, and I sat in the witness chair with my hands folded and my pulse steady, because I had learned a long time ago that the moment to look calm is precisely the moment everyone expects you to break. Judge Wren was not a woman who tolerated theater, and something in the deliberate cruelty of Bradley's phrasing, "cannot keep her own story straight," made her set down her pen with a small, deliberate click against the bench that silenced the room faster than any objection could have. But she did not intervene yet. She let the record build, because a good judge, Hayes had told me once, lets both sides finish burying themselves before she starts digging anyone out, and I had to trust that instinct, even as Bradley kept walking toward the exact center of the trap I had spent 4 months quietly building with Colonel Hayes. The sealed envelope from my father's garage lockbox arrived at Hayes's office by certified courier on a Monday, and by Thursday it had been logged, reviewed by a records custodian at the Pentagon, and cleared, with specific redactions, for submission as Exhibit 14 in a civil family court case in Maryland, a process Hayes described to me afterward as the fastest declassification review I have personally witnessed in 26 years, because a 2-star general made 3 phone calls himself. General Castellano's letter, 4 pages, typed on his personal letterhead and countersigned by 2 witnesses, described in redacted but legally sufficient detail my role during the classified operation, my documented traumatic brain injury sustained in the direct performance of hazardous duty, and the general's own words, which Hayes read aloud to the court on the 4th day of the hearing, in a voice that filled every corner of that room. Lieutenant Colonel Diane Marsh's record of service is among the most decorated and least publicly acknowledged in my 31 years commanding soldiers, precisely because acknowledging it publicly would have endangered lives, including her own. Any suggestion that her medical condition is fabricated is not only false, it is an insult to the sacrifice she made and continues to pay for daily. Quote, "The courtroom did not erupt, not in the way television teaches you to expect. It went silent, in the particular, total way a room goes silent when everyone in it is recalculating, all at once, who they thought a person was." I watched Eleanor Marsh's face change in real time, the practiced pleasantness draining out of it like water from a cracked glass, replaced by something closer to fear, because she understood, faster than her son did, exactly how much of her own sworn affidavit had just been contradicted on the record by a 2-star general. Bradley Finch, to his credit as a courtroom animal if nothing else, tried to recover, standing to object that the letter was self-serving and untested, and Judge Wren looked at him over the top of her reading glasses and said, "Counselor, the witness who wrote it is available by video conference this afternoon, if you'd like to test it." And Bradley sat back down without another word, and I watched him do the math of a man realizing, 3 months too late, that he had built his entire case on the assumption that no one above the rank of civilian doctor would ever bother to correct the record. General Castellano did appear by video conference that afternoon, seated in front of a plain grey background in his home office, still ramrod straight in a golf shirt at 71 years old, and when Bradley Finch, rattled now and overcorrecting, asked him directly whether it was possible Lieutenant Colonel Marsh had exaggerated her role to family members over the years. The general's answer landed in that courtroom like a verdict before the verdict. He said, "Counselor, I have signed condolence letters to the families of soldiers who did not come home from operations. Lieutenant Colonel Marsh helped plan, and in one case, physically extracted people from under fire to keep that list of names shorter than it would otherwise have been. If anything, she exaggerated in the other direction, for 14 years, at her own family's dinner table, because the truth was classified, and she took an oath more seriously than most people take their marriage vows. She was never a secretary. She was never fingerprinting paperwork in an office. I would trust that woman with my life, because I have, more than once, and it came back to me intact." That sentence, spoken by a general in a golf shirt in front of a laptop camera, was the inversion of Eleanor's lobby remark at Mason's recital, the sentence I had filed away and never repeated to anyone, and Colonel Hayes, in his closing argument 2 days later, brought it back around with the precision of a man who had been planning the moment for months. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and said to the room, "The petitioner's own mother was recorded, by a witness present, describing Lieutenant Colonel Marsh as, and I quote her exact words, 'never really a soldier, more of a secretary who got to wear the uniform.' General Castellano, under oath, called her one of the most decorated officers he commanded in 31 years. I would ask this court to consider which of those two witnesses had actual access to the truth, and which one simply preferred a smaller, more convenient version of it." Judge Wren's ruling, delivered the following week in a courtroom that had, by then, filled with more spectators than any of the earlier sessions, including, I noticed, 3 veterans in service caps, who had apparently followed the case through a military spouse forum, was unambiguous. She denied Gregory Marsh's petition for sole custody in full, noting for the record that the instability allegation had been substantially and credibly rebutted by sworn testimony from a general officer and by declassified medical documentation the petitioner's counsel failed to adequately investigate before filing. She ordered joint legal custody with Mason's primary residence remaining with me, citing his demonstrated stability and consistency of care. She referred Bradley Finch's conduct, specifically his reliance on Eleanor Marsh's affidavit, without independent verification, and his repeated public characterization of my medical condition, before the court had ruled on its authenticity, to the State Bar's Ethics Committee for review, and in a detail that Hayes told me afterward was almost unheard of in a family court setting, she added a verbal admonishment directed at Eleanor Marsh personally, stating that a grandmother's willingness to sign a false affidavit against her son's wife, in an apparent effort to secure custody leverage over a grandchild, reflects poorly on this court's confidence in the petitioner's proposed household, language that effectively ended any argument Greg's side had left to make. The consequences arrived unevenly over the following months, the way consequences usually do, landing hardest on the people least prepared to absorb them. Bradley Finch's ethics referral became public record within weeks, and 2 other family court judges in the same jurisdiction began scrutinizing his filings more closely, a professional cost he complained about privately, according to a mutual acquaintance, as reputational damage from a case I should have vetted better. Eleanor Marsh stopped attending the country club's Thursday luncheon circuit for the better part of a year, after, I'm told, at least 2 friends there quietly distanced themselves once the story of the affidavit circulated, the specific social currency she had spent 30 years accumulating, suddenly worth considerably less among people who valued appearances above almost everything else. Vanessa Cole's relationship with Greg, which had never survived well outside the specific oxygen of his marriage's collapse, ended 4 months after the ruling, quietly, without a public scene, though a colleague of Greg's later mentioned to Hayes's paralegal, who mentioned it to me, that Vanessa had told a mutual friend she hadn't realized how much of what Greg said about his wife was just Greg. Greg himself did something I did not expect, and I want to be honest that I still don't fully know what to make of it. 6 weeks after the ruling, he asked, through our joint attorneys, whether I would be willing to meet him without lawyers present, at a coffee shop near Mason's school, to talk, in his words, about Mason, and about what I got wrong. I went. He looked older than he had 6 months earlier, the particular kind of older that comes from watching your own certainty about a person get publicly dismantled by a general officer. He told me he had spent his whole marriage assuming that because I never argued back against Eleanor's comments, it meant I agreed there was nothing to argue about. And he said, quietly, staring at his coffee rather than at me, "I think I told myself a story where you were the boring, steady one, so I didn't have to feel like the boring, steady one myself. And it was easier to believe that than to ask you a single real question about what you actually did over there." I did not forgive him that day, and I told him so plainly, because forgiveness is not something a person earns by finally noticing the damage 6 years too late. But I agreed to co-parent Mason with him in good faith, for Mason's sake, and in the 18 months since, he has, to his credit, shown up for that part consistently, which is more than I can say he'd earned the benefit of the doubt on beforehand. Mason is 10 now, and he asked me last month, apropos of nothing, sitting at our kitchen table doing math homework, whether it was true that a general had once called me a hero on a computer screen in a courtroom. I told him it was true. He asked why nobody had told him that before, and I told him the honest answer, that some things a soldier carries have to stay quiet for a long time. Sometimes so long that the people closest to you never get the full picture until circumstances force it into the light, and that the not telling was never about him, and never about not trusting the people at that table. It was about a promise I made to my country before I ever made any of the promises I made to my family. He thought about that for a long moment, the way Mason thinks about most things, slowly and completely, and then he said, "I'm glad the judge found out anyway," and went back to his fractions. And I sat there thinking about every version of this story, where nobody had bothered to open the envelope in time, and how many families, right now, are sitting at dinner tables letting the quietest, steadiest person at the table be called small, simply because nobody has thought to ask what they actually carried to earn their silence. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to sit with, it's this. The people who love us loudest are not always the people who see us most clearly, and sometimes, the ones who never raise their voice are the ones who have already survived something none of us would have the stomach for. I think about Eleanor at that recital lobby more than I probably should, and I think about how easy it would have been for her to simply ask me one real question, instead of deciding, in advance, what my answer would have been. How many people in your own life have you already decided you understand completely, without ever once asking them the one question that would have told you otherwise? I still have that lockbox in my father's garage, empty now except for a copy of General Castellano's letter, and a folded program from Mason's recital, that I kept for reasons I'm still working out myself. I still remember the exact sound Judge Wren's gavel made, that final day, not the sharp crack television teaches you to expect, but a duller, almost gentle knock, like a door closing somewhere down a long hallway. And I remember the smell of that courtroom too, old wood polish, and the particular sterile chill of a building's air conditioning fighting a Maryland spring. And I remember thinking, absurdly, that I would carry that specific smell for the rest of my life, the same way I still carry the smell of the field hospital, where I got this scar. And there's a phone call I got 2 nights ago, from a number I didn't recognize, from a woman who said she'd found my story through a veteran spouse group, and needed to ask me something about a hearing of her own next month. Something about a sealed medical file, and a husband's attorney who kept using the word psychogenic like a weapon. And I hadn't even finished telling her what to ask her own JAG contact for, when she started crying on the phone, in a way that told me everything about how long she'd been carrying this alone. And that's a conversation you are not ready for yet, but you will be, in the next video. And if you've made it this far with me tonight, you already know, sitting there right now, exactly why you should hit subscribe before you go, before this screen cuts to the next one.